Usually when we think about building a new society, we imagine it requires like a blueprint, right?
Right, you have a very clear plan.
Exactly, like a
That
precise, orderly schematic where the architect points to a spot and says, you know, that is where the load-bearing pillars go.
Which makes sense for normal construction.
Right. But when you look at the Russian Revolution, that blueprint is just, it's basically on fire.
Completely, just up in flames.
We are looking at a society trying to violently demolish its own foundation, tear up the floorboards, and dynamite the walls. And all while 125 million people are still living inside the building.
That's a terrifying mental image, honestly.
It really is. So today, we are tracing the mechanics of the most violent, seismic, societal earthquake in human history. Welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here for this one.
Our sources today are highly detailed transcripts from a comprehensive historical lecture series. And our mission here is to trace the colossal forces that built the Russian Empire, tore it down to the studs, and, well, replaced it with a radical, world-altering Soviet system.
Right, because we want to uncover how an entire civilization can completely, fundamentally transform itself in just a few decades.
Exactly.
The sheer velocity of that transformation is what makes this history so critical to dissect.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, we are talking about leapfrogging centuries of economic and political development in the span of a single generation.
Yeah.
And, the unimaginable human toll required to force that kind of speed.
Right. Now, before we jump into the timeline, I do need to share a quick but mandatory neutrality disclaimer with you.
Oh, right. Very important for this topic.
Yeah, totally. So our source material today naturally contains heavily politically charged concepts involving capitalism, socialism, and communism.
Which always gets people fired up.
Always. So we are not taking any sides or endorsing the viewpoints of the original content. We are simply acting as your neutral guides, impartially unpacking the historical ideas contained in the sources.
Exactly. Our goal is just to examine the functional mechanics of these systems. We want to look at the structural incentives, the economic pressures, and the political survival tactics that drove these historical actors. We're leaving the ideological judgments completely up to you.
Perfect. Okay, let's unpack this. Because to even begin to comprehend a revolution of this magnitude, we really have to grasp the sheer, overwhelming scale of the stage it was set on.
The geography alone is just mind-boggling.
It is. By the time we reach the dawn of the 20th century, the Russian Empire is an incomprehensible landmass. I mean, it stretches entirely across Eurasia.
Yeah.
It's bordering the industrialized empires of Europe, the ancient societies of the Middle East, and the vast borders of China.
It's basically a continent unto itself.
Literally.
Yeah.
And it's home to roughly 125 million people speaking dozens of different languages.
And they are all standing poised on the edge of this massive historical cliff.
Right. But to understand why the ground beneath them gives way, we actually need to rewind the clock way back to the 9th century.
Oh, we're going way back.
Way back to a place called the Duchy of Kiev.
Yes. Because the monolithic, autocratic, top-down Russian state that ultimately explodes in 1917, it was not the inevitable destiny of this region.
Right. It didn't have to be that way.
Not at all. If we look at the 9th century, the center of economic and political gravity was in Kiev, which is, what is now the capital of Ukraine.
Okay.
And the sources point out something really crucial here. Kiev operated with what historians sometimes call a liberal tradition.
Wait, liberal in the 9th century? I feel like I want to be careful with our definitions here. We aren't talking about, like, representative democracy or voting booths, right?
No, far from it. Liberal, in this medieval context, simply means a division of power.
Okay.
Think of it more like a political cartel. The Duchy of Kiev featured a monarch, the Duke, but his power was absolutely not absolute.
He couldn't just do whatever he wanted.
Right. He had to constantly negotiate with other massive power centers. You had the boyars, who were the immensely wealthy landowning nobility.
Right.
And you had the Orthodox Christian Church. If the Duke wanted to wage a war or change the laws, he couldn't just snap his fingers.
So there was a constant push and pull.
Exactly. The nobility had a highly functional voice in the governance of the state.
Okay, so it's a structural balance. That actually looks very similar to the feudal systems developing in Western Europe around the same time, right? Like pre-revolutionary France or England.
Yeah, very similar.
Where the king is always somewhat paranoid about his barons turning against him.
Exactly. That dynamic. It forces a degree of political compromise.
Right.
But that entire political ecosystem, that balanced set of relationships in Kiev, is completely wiped off the map in the 13th century by an outside force.
The Mongol invasion. And we aren't just talking about a border dispute here. This is a total annihilation of the existing political infrastructure.
Absolute annihilation. The Mongols sweep across the Eurasian plains with unmatched military logistics and cavalry tactics.
Yeah, they were a terrifying force.
Yep. They besieged the cities, burned the administrative centers, and completely subordinate the region to the Golden Horde.
Wow.
For over a century, the political development of the region is basically frozen under the crushing weight of paying tribute to an occupying empire.
That is just a profound generational trauma. It literally severs the region from the political developments happening in the rest of Europe.
Exactly.
Which leaves a massive vacuum when the Mongol grip finally starts to weaken, right?
Yeah.
And it's not Kiev that rises from those ashes. By the 14th century, around 1328, a different settlement begins to consolidate power.
Right. Moscow.
Moscow.
And Moscow starts out essentially as the primary tax collectors for the Mongols.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they use that position to enrich themselves and build an army until they are finally strong enough to turn on their overlords.
Talk about a long game.
Seriously. So by 1480, under Duke Ivan III, often called Ivan the Great Moscow, officially breaks free.
Okay.
But Ivan doesn't just want to be an independent duke. He builds an entirely new, heavily centralized identity for his state.
Right.
He aggressively promotes the ideology that Moscow is the third Rome.
Which is a massive ideological flex. I mean, the first Rome in Italy fell to the barbarians.
Yep.
The second Rome, Constantinople, which was the headquarters of their Orthodox faith, fell to the Ottoman Empire in 1453.
Right, so there's a huge void there.
Exactly. So Ivan III is basically looking around and declaring, we are the last bastion of true divine civilization left on Earth.
And consider the structural justification that ideology provides.
Yeah.
If you are just a local duke, your authority ends at the edge of your farmland.
Sure.
But if you are the sacred, divine center of the final true empire on Earth, your authority is limitless.
Wow. Yeah, that changes the whole game.
It wasn't merely a religious boast to make the peasants feel good either. It was the foundational architecture for absolute autocracy.
Right.
The rulers of Moscow claimed a sacred duty to provide peace and stability to the savage lands around them. And their primary mechanism for doing so was endless, relentless imperial expansion.
It's like hitting the reset button on a computer's operating system.
That's a great way to put it.
Like the old Kiev system had localized checks and balances, multiple users with different permissions.
Right.
The new Moscow update is a pure top-down administrative lockout. The user, the czar, has absolute root access, and nobody else can even open the command terminal.
That analogy perfectly captures the systemic shift.
Yeah.
Because the Mongols had essentially leveled the playing field by destroying the old Kievan elites, the new dukes of Moscow didn't have to negotiate with deeply entrenched barons.
Ah, they had a blank slate.
Exactly. They built the system from the ground up with themselves at the absolute pinnacle.
Wow.
They never allowed the development of the institutional friction you saw in France with the parliaments or in England with the Magna Carta.
So there's no pushback mechanism at all.
None. By the 16th century, these rulers adopt the title of Tsar, derived from Caesar, and they wield a degree of absolute unchecked control that is virtually unmatched by any other monarch in the Western world.
And when you trace the map described in our sources, you see this ideology manifesting physically.
Oh, absolutely.
In the early 1500s, Muscovy is this relatively small, dark speck on the map. But driven by this divine mandate to expand and secure its borders, it just violently balloons outward.
Right.
By 1598, it is massively expanded, and by 1689, it has swallowed the entirety of Siberia, pushing its borders thousands of miles east to the very edges of China.
But the central function of the state becoming purely military and expansionist, it creates a fatal structural vulnerability.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, the Tsar's unwritten social contract with his subjects is simple. I have absolute power over your lives, but in exchange, I provide infinite military protection and glory.
Okay, I see where this is going.
If the state ever encounters a barrier it cannot conquer or suffers a defeat that exposes its weakness, the entire justification for the autocracy instantly evaporates.
And we are definitely going to see that exact vulnerability fracture the empire later on.
We certainly are.
But I want to pause here and look at the ground level for a second. We are talking about expanding an empire across thousands of miles of hostile terrain.
Yeah, it's a massive undertaking.
That requires an ocean of resources. It requires grain, it requires steel, and most importantly, it requires human labor.
Tons of it.
Right. How did this absolute power practically function for the millions of regular people who are tasked with actually building this empire?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the sheer geographic vastness of Russia was actually a massive problem for the czars.
Because it's too big to manage.
Exactly. In a small country, you can control the labor pool easily.
Hmm.
But in Russia, if a peasant didn't like how a noble was treating them, they could just walk eastward into the frontier.
They could just leave.
Yeah, they could run away to the borderlands and join the Cossacks.
Which means the landowning elites who the Tsar relies on to fund his military are constantly losing their workforce.
Precisely. The state needed guaranteed, immovable agricultural output to fund its military machine.
Yeah.
So, to prevent the labor force from simply walking away into the vastness of Eurasia, the state systematically dismantled the freedom of the peasantry.
Oh, wow.
While agricultural workers in Western Europe were slowly clawing back rights and moving toward wage labor, Russia went in the stark opposite direction.
Right.
In 1649, a sweeping legal code was enacted that officially and totally formalized the institution of serfdom.
And our sources make a point to draw a very thick, dark line here. This wasn't just an unfair labor contract or a bad deal for tenant farmers.
No, not at all.
About half of the entire rural population was reduced to a status of virtual slavery.
Virtual slavery, but with a highly specific, fundamentally dehumanizing legal mechanism.
Right.
In traditional chattel slavery, as practiced in the Americas, a human being is the direct personal property of an owner and can be bought, sold, or moved anywhere at the owner's whim.
Yeah.
A Russian serf, however, was legally tied directly to the property itself.
That is just so wild to me. Imagine living in a system where the law considers you to be an indistinguishable feature of the local geography.
Yeah, you're part of the landscape.
Exactly. You are legally classified the same way as a mature oak tree, a stone wall, or a creek.
Yep.
The noble couldn't necessarily sell you to a guy 3 towns over, but if he sold the entire estate, you went with the dirt.
And this legal reality meant that half the population was entirely stripped of personal initiative.
Right.
They could not choose their profession, they could not legally travel without permission, and the vast majority of their labor went directly to enriching the estate owner.
That's incredibly bleak.
Furthermore, the Tsarist state itself functioned differently than Western governments. It wasn't just a bureaucracy that collected taxes and managed armies.
Right.
The Russian state operated as the ultimate, undisputed corporate monopoly.
Yeah, the sources are fascinating on this point. The government itself was the largest landowner, directly owning millions of state serfs.
Which is just staggering.
They owned the largest factories, they owned the mining operations in the Ural Mountains.
Oh, and everything.
Exactly. If a private individual wanted to manufacture something, they often needed a specific, granted license from the Tsar. The state's footprint in the daily economy was suffocatingly large.
Which brings us to the psychological and economic consequences of this design.
Yeah.
When you build an economy entirely on the backs of laborers who have zero freedom and zero prospect of personal advancement, you actively murder innovation.
Absolutely.
Why in the world would a serf spend his evenings inventing a more efficient plow?
There's no incentive.
Exactly. Why would he work twice as hard to clear a new field? Every single ounce of surplus value he generates will be immediately confiscated by the noble or the state tax collector.
It's an economic machine perfectly designed to produce stagnation.
And it bred a deeply ingrained tradition of apocalyptic, violent pushback.
Oh, I bet.
When people have no legal avenues to air grievances, no courts, no petitions, no representation, their only recourse is violence.
Right.
The Russian countryside was effectively a steam engine, where the government kept shoveling in coal to fund its wars while actively welding all the pressure release valves shut.
Wow. And occasionally that boiler exploded.
Oh, it did.
The sources detail the rebellion of Yemelyan Pugachev in the 1770s, which is just a wild piece of history.
It really is.
Pugachev was a disillusioned Cossack who managed to convince an enormous swath of the peasant population that he was actually the recently assassinated Tsar Peter III.
Yeah, just impersonating a dead guy.
And he promised to end serfdom, and he unleashed a wave of absolute terror.
Pugachev didn't just lead a minor peasant strike. He amassed a sprawling, brutal army of serfs, escaped convicts, and religious minorities.
Just a massive coalition of the angry.
Exactly. They swept through the Volga region, stringing up thousands of noblemen, burning estates to the ground, and slaughtering government officials.
That's terrifying.
He actually held the mighty Russian Imperial Army at bay for nearly a year. The panic in St. Petersburg was profound.
But wait, if the military was so powerful and the state had total control, how did a guy pretending to be a ghost manage to hold off the empire for a year?
It's a great question.
Like, why didn't the nobility look at this bloodbath and say, okay, clearly serfdom is a suicide pact. We need to reform this immediately before we all get our heads chopped off?
Because the nobility's fear of the peasants was ultimately eclipsed by their reliance on the Tsar's military to protect their wealth.
Ah, okay.
The Pugachev rebellion terrified the elite, but instead of inspiring reform, it convinced them that the peasantry was a savage, feral force that required an even heavier boot on their necks.
So they just pushed down harder.
Exactly. Once the military finally crushed Pugachev, the state retreated into an ideological fortress. They doubled down on the autocracy.
But the czars weren't completely blind, right? They sat in their palaces, looked across the borders into Western Europe, and they could plainly see that countries like Britain and France were getting richer, their militaries were getting deadlier, and their industries were booming.
Right, they could see the writing on the wall.
The Russian elite wanted those toys, which leads us to an incredibly bizarre historical dynamic: the paradox of selective westernization.
This is a vital through line for understanding the eventual collapse.
Yeah.
Down through the centuries, you have monumental figures like Peter the Great in the early 1700s, Catherine the Great, and later Alexander II.
Right.
These monarchs looked at Europe and recognized that Russia was technologically backward. They recognized that a modernized economy produced better artillery, faster ships, and more efficient bureaucracies.
Here's where it gets really interesting. These autocrats desperately wanted the fruits of the Western Enlightenment, but they wanted absolutely nothing to do with the roots.
Bingo.
They wanted British factory efficiency and Prussian military organization, but if someone even whispered the words parliament, constitution, or civil rights, they were thrown in a dungeon.
It is the ultimate hubris. They believed they could surgically extract the technological and administrative innovations of the West while violently rejecting the social and political freedoms that actually generated those innovations.
Right, it doesn't work that way.
I mean, Peter the Great literally built his new capital, St. Petersburg, on a malarial swamp using the forced labor of tens of thousands of serfs who died in the mud.
Unbelievable.
Also, we could have a modern window to the West with a deep-water navy.
They are trying to build a modern police state. They want telegrams and railroads, but only so the Tsar's secret police can communicate faster and move troops quicker to crush rebellions.
Exactly.
They fundamentally fail to understand that when you teach a population to read so they can operate complex factory machinery, they are eventually going to use that literacy to read political philosophy.
And the devastating wake-up call that this half-measure westernization was failing miserably arrived in the mid-19th century with the Crimean War.
Oh man, let's look at the mechanics of this war, because it exposes the total rot inside the Russian machine.
It really does.
In the 1850s, Russia fights a war primarily against the British and the French. And where are they fighting? The Crimean Peninsula, the Black Sea. This is virtually in Russia's own backyard.
Geographically, Russia should have possessed an insurmountable logistical advantage.
Right.
The British and the French had to load their armies onto ships, sail thousands of miles across the Mediterranean, navigate the Bosporus, and establish beachheads in hostile territory.
Yeah.
The Russians just had to march south.
But they couldn't do it.
No, they couldn't.
The Russian logistical network was so archaic, relying on mud roads and horse-drawn carts, that it actually took the Russian army longer to move troops and supplies down through their own country than it took the British to sail all the way from London.
It's almost comical if it weren't so tragic.
It's crazy.
Furthermore, the Russian infantry was armed with outdated smoothbore muskets, while the British and French had modern rifled weapons that could accurately hit targets at 3 times the distance.
Wow.
The Russian military, the central pillar of the Tsar's autocracy, was comprehensively humiliated. They lost the war on their own doorstep.
It shattered the illusion of Russian invincibility. It proved to the entire world, and more importantly to the Tsar himself, that an empire built on the backs of enslaved, illiterate farmers could no longer compete with industrialized capitalist nations.
Right.
They were rapidly falling behind, and if they didn't adapt, the empire would be carved up by its neighbors.
This profound humiliation forced the hand of Tsar Alexander II. He realized that the institution of serfdom was no longer just a moral blight. It was a lethal strategic vulnerability.
He had to do something.
The agrarian economy was too stagnant to fund a modern military-industrial complex. And so in 1861, Alexander II issued a decree that emancipated the serfs.
Which sounds amazing on paper. Overnight, over 40 million people are legally freed from virtual slavery.
Yeah.
But remember, this wasn't done out of a sudden awakening of human rights. It was pure, cold, systemic calculation. He needed the peasants to become more productive.
But the execution of this emancipation reveals the crippling fear at the heart of the autocracy.
How so?
The state was terrified. They thought, if we just declare 40 million peasants totally free today, what stops them from walking off the estates tomorrow?
Oh, right.
Who will harvest the grain? What if they all flood into St. Petersburg and Moscow and cause a massive, uncontrollable urban crisis?
So they decide to free the serfs, but immediately shackle them to a mountain of inescapable debt.
Exactly.
The government effectively bought the land from the nobles and then forced the newly freed peasants to buy it back from the government through what they called redemption payments.
Yep.
And these weren't small loans. This was a 40-year mortgage payable to the Tsar.
Let's drill down into the functional mechanics of this debt, because it explains the rural misery of the next 50 years.
Yeah, please do.
The government was not going to send a tax collector to knock on 40 million individual doors. That was administratively impossible.
Sure.
Instead, they assigned the debt collectively to the traditional village councils, known as the mir.
Which turns the entire village into a financial prison.
It absolutely does.
If your neighbor decides he is sick of farming and tries to sneak off to the city in the middle of the night, the government's bill to the mir doesn't go down. Your neighbor's portion of the debt is just instantly absorbed by everyone else who stayed behind.
Exactly. The village elders essentially became prison guards for their own communities.
Wow.
They strictly controlled who could leave, who could marry, and how the land was used, because the collective financial survival of the village depended on extracting every drop of labor from its inhabitants.
And to maintain what they considered fairness, the mir mandated a practice called strip farming.
Yeah, this part is crucial.
Instead of one farmer owning a solid, square, 10-acre field where he could plant what he wanted, the mir divided all the village land into alternating, incredibly narrow strips.
The logic was that everyone should get an equal share of the good soil by the river, and everyone should share the burden of the rocky soil up on the hill.
Makes sense in theory.
But mechanistically, it was an economic straitjacket. If you are farming a strip of land that is only a few yards wide, you cannot use advanced machinery.
Right.
You can't introduce a heavy multi-horse plow because you physically cannot turn the team around without trampling your neighbor's crops.
It is the ultimate catastrophic half measure.
Perfectly said.
The Tsar recognized the core problem that serfdom was suffocating the economy, but he was so terrified of the true individual freedom that he engineered a new system that actively prevented the very agricultural efficiency he was trying to create.
Right.
They wanted the financial yield of a free market population while desperately clinging to total localized social control.
And historically, half measures rarely stabilize a failing system. They usually accelerate the crisis.
Absolutely.
By paralyzing agricultural innovation, the state ensured that the countryside remained desperately poor and prone to localized famines.
Yeah.
But time was running out. As the 19th century bled into the 20th, the Russian elites realized that slowly reforming agriculture wasn't going to save them from the rapidly industrializing powers of Germany and Britain.
He had to move faster.
If Russia was going to survive, it had to force industrialization, and it had to do it immediately.
Which brings us to a period of absolute blistering economic shock.
It's wild.
In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, under the guidance of incredibly ambitious government ministers like Sergei Witt and later Pyotr Stolypin, the Tsarist regime throws the empire into a period of hyper-industrialization.
Yeah.
And the metrics they achieve are staggering. In the 1890s, the Russian industrial economy is growing at a rate of roughly 15% a year.
A sustained 15% growth rate is an economic anomaly. It requires an astronomical infusion of capital to build the railroads, the steel mills, and the coal mines.
Exactly.
But this raises an important question. In a profoundly poor agrarian empire, where's the government getting the cash to fund this massive industrial leap?
They are squeezing it out of the peasants.
Yes, they are.
The government institutes policies designed to ruthlessly extract wealth from the rural villages to pay for the shiny new factories in the cities.
The mechanisms of this extraction were brutal. The state imposed forced grain sales.
Oh, tell me about that.
A peasant couldn't just take their surplus wheat to the open market and sell it to the highest bidder. They were forced to sell a quota to the government at an artificially depressed fixed price.
Wow.
The state would then export that grain to Europe at market value to buy industrial machinery.
That is just robbery. They also weaponized tariffs, right?
Yep.
To protect their infant domestic industries, the government placed massive tariffs on imported goods, which meant if a peasant needed a new iron plow or chemical fertilizer, it was suddenly vastly more expensive.
And perhaps the most cynical mechanism of all was the state monopoly on vodka.
Oh, I found this detail in the sources. Absolutely wild.
It's incredible.
Brewing and selling small batches of vodka was one of the few ways a peasant family could turn their leftover grain into hard currency during the winter. It was a crucial side hustle for survival.
The Tsarist government recognized how lucrative that market was, so they simply outlawed private sales and took over the entire industry.
Just like that.
Just like that.
Yeah.
They became the sole legal purveyor of vodka in the empire. At one point, nearly a third of the entire revenue of the Russian state was derived from selling vodka back to its own impoverished population.
That is wow.
They systematically drained the countryside of capital, leaving the peasantry teetering on the edge of starvation, all to fund the industrial utopia in the cities.
And that extreme rural poverty triggered a massive, jarring demographic shift. Peasants realized they could no longer survive in the villages, so they began migrating to the urban centers, St. Petersburg, Moscow, Kiev.
Yeah, and a massive influx.
But they weren't stepping into the kind of gradual, multi-generational industrial revolution that happened in England, where a farmer might move to a mid-sized town and work in a small textile shop.
No, this was an abrupt, violent shock to the human system.
Right.
These illiterate agrarian peasants were thrown directly from a medieval farming existence into massive, hyper-advanced industrial complexes.
Yeah.
We are talking about factories employing 3, 4, sometimes 5,000 workers under a single roof.
And the living conditions were specifically engineered to destroy human dignity.
They were horrific.
These workers weren't given quaint little row houses. They were crammed into colossal, overcrowded barracks built right next to the factories. We're talking about massive rooms lined with bunk beds where workers would sleep in shifts. The beds never got cold.
They are working 12 to 14 hours a day in deafening, dangerous conditions with zero safety regulations and zero legal right to form a union or strike.
Right.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the state essentially created massive pressure cookers of human misery.
Oh, for sure.
And to make this volatile mixture even more explosive, you have to look at who owned these factories.
Right. Because the Russian government couldn't fund this 15% growth entirely on vodka and stolen grain, they relied heavily on foreign investment.
Very heavily.
The sources highlight that a staggering 41% of corporate capital in Russia during this period belonged to foreigners. The British, the French, the Germans, the Belgians.
Put yourself in the shoes of a Russian worker.
Okay.
Not only are you being worked to the bone in a hazardous factory, living in a squalid, disease-ridden barrack, but your foreman might be speaking German, and the exorbitant profits you are generating are being shipped directly out of the country to banks in Paris or London.
It fuses two incredibly potent, visceral grievances, severe, undeniable class exploitation, and deeply wounded nationalism.
Exactly.
If you wanted to build a laboratory specifically designed to engineer violent revolutionaries, you could not do better than a St. Petersburg factory barrack.
It's the perfect recipe.
You take thousands of impoverished people, stack them on top of each other so they can easily communicate and organize, work them to the brink of death, and let them watch foreign bosses reap all the rewards. How could the Tsars not see this blowing up in their faces?
Because the autocracy was completely insulated by its own macroeconomic success.
They just looked at the numbers.
The ministers looked at the spreadsheets, saw the miles of new railroad track, saw the booming steel production, and concluded the system was working perfectly.
Unbelievable.
They treated the human cost as a temporary necessary friction. But while this new, angry proletariat was congealing in the cities, another crucial demographic was watching this misery unfold and taking meticulous notes.
Oh, right. The intelligentsia.
The intelligentsia.
The educated middle class. The university students, the lawyers, the lower-level bureaucrats, the writers.
Yes. For decades, this educated sliver of the population had been suffering an acute identity crisis.
How so?
They read Western philosophy, they traveled to Paris and Berlin, and they returned to Russia, acutely aware of how politically primitive their autocracy was.
Yeah.
When the writings of Karl Marx began circulating in the underground reading rooms in the 1880s, the intelligentsia devoured them.
even though Marxist theories were technically a mismatch for Russia, right?
That's the irony, yeah.
Marx explicitly wrote that a communist revolution could only happen in an advanced, late-stage capitalist society like Germany or Britain after the bourgeoisie had fully developed the industrial economy. Russia was still overwhelmingly an empire of dirt farmers.
Ideologically, it was a stretch. But practically, Marx's searing critique of the exploitation of labor mapped perfectly onto the nightmare unfolding in the Russian factories.
Right.
The intelligentsia didn't need to imagine the suffering proletariat Marx described. They could just look out their university windows and see them trudging back to the barracks in the snow.
But I want to highlight that before Marxism became the dominant revolutionary flavor, there was this other movement by the intelligentsia that is just a tragic comic failure.
Oh, populists.
Yes. In the 1870s, you have the populist movement, and they launched this initiative called Going to the People.
Right.
Thousands of these wealthy, educated urban idealists literally pack their bags, put on peasant clothes, and hike out into the deep rural villages to try and radicalize the farmers against the Tsar.
And it was a spectacular, almost embarrassing failure of communication.
Complete failure. You have these university students standing in a muddy village square, quoting abstract French political theory, talking about the dialectic of historical materialism, and the peasants are just staring at them.
They had no idea what they were talking about.
The cultural disconnect was absolute. The peasants didn't care about overthrowing the imperial structure. They wanted to know if these city kids knew a better way to cure a sick cow or how to petition the local noble for firewood.
Exactly.
Many peasants actually thought these students were foreign spies and handed them directly over to the Tsar's police.
And that humiliating failure, combined with the relentless, suffocating crackdown by the secret police, drove the opposition movement into a much darker, more violent psychological space.
Wow.
The radicals realized they couldn't slowly educate the massive conservative peasant base, so they decided they had to shatter the state through pure, concentrated terror.
Which gives rise to extremist factions like the People's Will. They abandoned mass organizing and embraced the strategy of political assassination. They believed that if they cut the head off the snake, the entire autocratic system would crumble in confusion.
Right.
And in 1881, after several failed attempts involving explosives and derailed trains, they finally succeeded. They threw a bomb at the carriage of Tsar Alexander II and blew his legs off. He bled to death in the Winter Palace.
But the mechanics of their theory failed.
It didn't work.
No. Assassinating the Tsar did not spark a glorious popular uprising. The state did not crumble. Instead, the assassination brought the full, terrifying weight of the autocracy down on the intelligentsia.
Oh, of course.
The new Tsar, Alexander III, built an even more expansive police state, executed the conspirators, and forced the revolutionary movement deep underground or into foreign exile.
Which proves that despite the misery of the peasants, the rage of the factory workers, and the bombs of the terrorists, the Tsarist regime was incredibly durable.
Very durable.
It had a massive army, a sprawling bureaucracy, and centuries of ideological momentum. A system that, entrenched, wasn't just going to fall over from a few student protests.
Yeah, it wasn't.
It required the people at the very top of the system to make a series of catastrophic, unforced errors.
And history provided the perfect architects for that disaster. Tsar Nicholas II, who took the throne in 1894, and his wife, Empress Alexandra.
Our sources do not mince words when assessing these two.
They really don't.
They describe Nicholas and Alexandra as an aggressively incompetent pairing. They were deeply isolated, profoundly superstitious, and absolutely convinced of their divine right to rule.
Yeah.
They were two people who would have struggled to manage a mid-sized post office, let alone an empire of 125 million people teetering on the edge of modernity.
This raises an important question that historians constantly debate when analyzing societal collapse. Is a revolution truly inevitable because the systemic rot is so deep, or is it merely triggered by the accidental stupidity of bad leadership?
Right, that's the big debate.
In the Russian case, it is a lethal synthesis of both. The systemic injustices, the land starvation, the factory exploitation stack the dynamite in the basement.
Yeah.
But Nicholas II repeatedly, almost enthusiastically, struck the matches.
Let's track the match strikes. Strike 1 comes in 1904 with the Russo-Japanese War.
Right.
Nicholas, adhering to that centuries-old Moscow operating system that demanded endless expansion, decides he wants to push Russian influence into Manchuria and Korea.
Which is a bold move.
This puts him on a direct collision course with the rising power of Japan.
The Russian high command was blinded by an incredibly toxic mix of imperial hubris and blatant racism.
Yeah, that played a huge part.
They looked at a map, saw a small island nation in Asia, and genuinely believed that the mighty Russian army would crush them in a matter of weeks.
Unbelievable.
They referred to the Japanese with horrific slurs and completely dismissed their rapidly modernized navy.
And the reality of the war was a geopolitical earthquake. The Japanese absolutely decimated the Russian forces.
It's a slaughter.
The logistics of the defeat are mind-boggling. Because the Trans-Siberian Railway wasn't finished, Nicholas sent his Baltic fleet, which was stationed near Europe, to sail all the way around the continent of Africa, across the Indian Ocean, just to reach the battle zone.
It took them 7 months.
7 months. And when they finally arrived at the Tsushima Strait, exhausted and out of coal, the Japanese Navy ambushed them and sent virtually the entire Russian fleet to the bottom of the ocean in a single afternoon.
It was an unprecedented humiliation. A major white European power had been comprehensively defeated by an Asian nation.
Yeah, that was huge.
The shockwave through Russian society was absolute. Remember the autocracy's core justification.
Yeah.
Absolute domestic control in exchange for absolute military dominance.
Right.
The Tsar had failed his only meaningful test.
And the humiliation of that defeat immediately triggered the 1905 revolution.
Yes, it did.
And the flashpoint of this uprising is one of the most heartbreaking, clarifying moments in history. In January 1905, in St. Petersburg, an event takes place that becomes known as Bloody Sunday.
If you want to understand how disconnected the Tsar was from the reality of his own capital city, you look at Bloody Sunday.
Set the scene for us, because these weren't hardened, bomb-throwing Marxists storming the barricades.
Not at all. This was a crowd of tens of thousands of desperate, starving factory workers and their families.
Right.
They were led by a charismatic Orthodox priest named Father Gupon. They were dressed in their Sunday best.
Wow.
They were carrying icons of the Virgin Mary and massive portraits of Tsar Nicholas.
Oh.
They were literally singing hymns as they marched through the snow toward the Winter Palace.
And they had drafted a petition, right? And the language of the petition is so telling.
It really is.
They aren't demanding the overthrow of the state. They are using language like, "Oh, sire, your children are freezing. We are being worked to death. We were starving. Please just listen to us."
Yeah.
They genuinely believed the myth of the benevolent Tsar. They thought the evil factory owners and bureaucrats were hiding the truth from Nicholas. And if the Tsar simply knew how much his people were suffering, he would swoop in and save them.
And how did the machinery of the autocracy respond to this desperate plea? As the unarmed crowd approached the palace square, the Tsarist imperial guard ordered them to disperse.
Right.
When the massive crowd couldn't move backward fast enough, the troops lowered their rifles and fired volley after volley directly into the packed masses of men, women, and children.
Oh, my God.
The cavalry then charged in with sabers drawn to hack down the survivors running through the snow.
Hundreds were killed, thousands wounded. And in that single afternoon, the myth of the little father Tsar was shattered forever.
Completely shattered.
The people realized the Tsar didn't just tolerate their suffering, he was actively willing to murder them to protect the status quo.
Exactly.
That massacre instantly detonated worker uprisings across the cities. The peasants heard the news and began violently seizing noble estates in the countryside. The military was dealing with mutinies. The entire empire ground to a halt.
The regime came within millimeters of total collapse right then in 1905.
So why didn't it?
But Nicholas survived for one critical reason. The elite power blocks the wealthy nobility, and the top military brass ultimately rallied behind him. They looked at the burning estates in the countryside and decided they feared a feral peasant revolution far more than they hated the Tsar's staggering incompetence.
But Nicholas couldn't just shoot his way entirely out of the crisis, right? He was forced, incredibly reluctantly, to make political concessions.
It was.
He issued the October Manifesto, which promised a constitution of sorts, and he established a representative legislative body called the Duma.
But you have to look at the mechanics of this reform. It was a complete sham designed to buy time.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Nicholas firmly believed that his autocratic power was granted by God, and he had no intention of actually sharing it with the parliament.
Right. He engineers the electoral laws so heavily that a single wealthy nobleman's vote is worth the votes of thousands of peasants.
Yep.
The Duma ends up being packed with conservative loyalists, and even then, if they drafted a law Nicholas didn't like, he just vetoed it or dissolved the Duma entirely.
He built the facade of a constitutional monarchy while violently preserving the core engine of autocracy.
Which was his second fatal error. By
Yes.
refusing to allow a genuine functional parliament to absorb some of the political heat, Nicholas ensured that when the next massive crisis hit, there would be no buffer between him and the rage of the populace. He would own every failure personally.
And the ultimate empire-breaking crisis arrived in the summer of 1914,
World War I.
World War I.
Russia gets dragged into the conflict to protect its ally, Serbia, and it pits the fragile, semi-industrialized Russian Empire directly against the industrial juggernaut of the German military machine.
And the result is apocalyptic.
Yeah.
Between 1914 and 1917, the Russian Empire suffers an incomprehensible 5 million casualties.
5 million. It's hard to even picture.
The scale of the slaughter exposes every single rotting beam in the Russian infrastructure. The military had a massive pool of manpower, millions of peasant conscripts, but they had absolutely no logistical capacity to arm or supply them. The real network was a fraction of what Germany possessed.
The human reality of this is sickening. The sources point out that Russian commanders were sending whole divisions of young men into the trenches without rifles.
I couldn't believe
The orders were literally, charge the machine guns, and when the guy in front of you is blown to pieces, pick up his weapon and keep running.
Rah.
They didn't have enough boots, they didn't have bandages. Far more Russian soldiers were dying of dysentery, typhus, and minor wounds that became infected than were actually being killed by German artillery.
It was a mechanized meat grinder operating on peasant flesh.
Yeah, that's a brutal way to put it, but accurate.
And the economic dislocation back home was equally catastrophic.
Oh.
Because the rail system was entirely dedicated to the war effort, food from the countryside couldn't reach the cities.
Right, the supply chains were completely broken.
St. Petersburg and Moscow were literally starving. Inflation skyrocketed. The social contract was completely pulverized.
And how does Tsar Nicholas respond to the greatest crisis in the history of his empire? He makes the single most destructive decision imaginable.
He really does.
In 1915, he fires his top generals, leaves the capital, and travels to the military headquarters at the front lines to take direct personal command of the entire Russian war effort.
A role for which he had zero training, zero strategic intellect, and zero competence.
Zero. By doing this, he stripped away his last layer of deniability. Before, he could blame a bad general for a defeat. Now, every time 1,000 peasants were slaughtered in a botched offensive, it was the direct personal fault of the Tsar.
And by physically vacating the capital of St. Petersburg, he left the daily administration of the collapsing government in the hands of his wife, Empress Alexandra.
Which introduces the ultimate wild card into this history, Grigory Rasputin.
We have to explain the mechanics of this relationship because it sounds like fiction.
It really does. It's so weird.
The heir to the Russian throne, a young boy named Alexei, suffered from hemophilia. It's a genetic disease where the blood lacks clotting protein. Even a minor bump or bruise could cause uncontrollable internal bleeding and excruciating pain.
The royal family kept the disease a strict state secret, but Alexandra was frantic. She was desperate to save her son.
Understandably.
And into this desperation walks Rasputin, a wandering, charismatic, deeply controversial mystic monk from Siberia. And for reasons that historians and medical experts still debate, when Rasputin was around, the boy's bleeding seemed to stop.
Whether it was a hypnotic calming effect that lowered the boy's blood pressure, or simply that Rasputin kept the incompetent royal doctors and their leeches away from the child, the result was the same.
Yeah.
Alexandra came to view Rasputin as a literal messenger from God, the only man who could save the dynasty.
And because she believed that, Rasputin gained immense, entirely unchecked political influence over the empress.
Huge influence.
So while Nicholas is butchering the army at the front, Alexandra and Rasputin are essentially running the civilian government into the ground back home.
Yeah.
Rasputin is advising her to fire competent ministers who oppose him and replace them with corrupt sycophants.
The optics were politically fatal. You have soldiers dying in the mud without boots, mothers waiting in line for bread that doesn't exist, and the rumor in the capital is that the entire empire is being puppeted by a debauched, illiterate mystic who has the empress under a spell.
It's just a PR nightmare.
The legitimacy of the regime evaporated. It was so transparently disastrous that conservative members of the Duma and the royal family were openly whispering about whether Alexandra was a German spy or if the autocracy had simply gone insane.
It reaches a point of such sheer frantic desperation among the elite that a small group of highly placed noblemen decide the only way to save the monarchy from itself is to murder Rasputin.
And the assassination itself is a perfect microcosm of the chaotic dysfunction of the late empire. He wasn't a clean professional hit.
No, it is a gruesome, bizarre comedy of errors.
Very gruesome.
In December 1916, they lure him to a palace, and they feed him cakes laced with enough cyanide to kill a horse. Rasputin eats them and just asks for more wine.
Which is insane.
Right. Panicking, one of the nobles pulls a revolver and shoots him in the chest. They think he's dead, but later Rasputin leaps up, attacks his assassin, and runs out into the snowy courtyard.
It's like a horror movie.
They chase him down, shoot him 2 more times, beat him with a rubber club, wrap his body in heavy chains, and throw him into an icy river.
But eliminating the mystic did absolutely nothing to fix the structural rot.
Of course not.
The Tsarist regime had spent 50 years extracting the wealth of its poorest citizens, forced millions into urban squalor, and then fed an entire generation into the mechanized slaughter of World War I.
Yeah.
By early 1917, the 300-year-old Romanov dynasty wasn't a structure anymore. It was a hollow shell held together by habit. It just needed a slight push.
Which brings us to the year everything finally breaks, 1917.
1917.
In February, massive bread riots break out in Petrograd, which was the new, less German-sounding name for St. Petersburg. Women demanding food take to the streets, and they're quickly joined by striking factory workers.
And here's the mechanical difference between 1905 and 1917. In 1905, the Tsar ordered the troops to fire on the crowd, and they obeyed. In February 1917, the Tsar wires the garrison commander and orders him to clear the streets.
But this time it's different.
But this time, the soldiers look at the starving women, they think about the millions of their brothers dead in the trenches, and they refuse. The Cossacks, the ultimate loyal enforcers of the state, lower their rifles and join the protesters.
The moment the military monopoly on violence evaporates, the autocracy ceases to exist.
Instantly.
Within days, Tsar Nicholas II is forced to abdicate. He tries to pass the crown to his brother, but his brother looks at the toxic revolutionary inferno and basically says, absolutely not. In a matter of a week, a 300-year-old absolute monarchy just vanishes.
And suddenly, for the first time in Russian history, there is a massive power vacuum.
Right. To fill that vacuum, a group of moderate politicians from the old Duma step up and form the provisional government.
Yes.
They are led eventually by a charismatic lawyer named Alexander Kerensky. Their goal is to finally bring the liberal tradition back to Russia. They want to hold democratic elections, write a constitution, and build a functioning Western-style parliamentary republic.
But the provisional government makes a fatal, incomprehensible error of political calculation.
What's that?
They decide to keep fighting World War I.
Why? The war is the exact thing that just destroyed the Tsar. Why would they inherit that poison pill?
Because they were trapped by international finance and bourgeois honor. The provisional government desperately needed loans from Britain and France to keep the state bankrupt economy afloat.
Ah, the money.
And the Allies made it clear. If you drop out of the war and let the Germans move all their troops to the Western Front, we cut off the money.
Makes sense from the Allies' perspective.
Furthermore, these liberal politicians believed that a new democratic Russia could inspire the troops to fight better. They launched a massive new attack called the Galician Offensive.
And it is another spectacular, bloody failure. The troops don't care about a new constitution. They care about not getting blown up by artillery.
Exactly.
The provisional government completely misread the room. They were in the palaces debating the nuances of constitutional law, while the actual population was dying in the trenches and starving in the streets.
And because the government wasn't addressing the immediate survival needs of the population, the people started building their own parallel structures of power.
Right.
This is the crucial mechanical shift. In the cities, the factory workers began organizing Soviets.
And we need to define that word because it becomes the name of the empire. But at this moment, Soviet just means a council.
Exactly. A Soviet was a grassroots, hyper-local democratic council.
Okay.
Factory workers would elect representatives from their own floor to coordinate strikes, manage food distribution, and eventually to run the factories themselves.
Wow.
In the military, soldiers formed their own Soviets and issued Order Number 1, which essentially stated that its soldiers only had to obey the provisional government if their local Soviet agreed with the order.
Oh, that's wild.
In the countryside, peasants were forming land committees and just violently confiscating noble estates.
It is absolute Decentralized chaos. The provisional government has the official title, but the Soviets have the actual manpower and the guns.
Yes, they do.
And it is into this highly unstable dual power dynamic that Vladimir Lenin re-enters the picture.
Lenin had been in exile in Switzerland for years.
Mhm.
The Tsar's secret police weren't going to let the leader of the radical Bolshevik faction just wander around preaching Marxist revolution.
Of course not.
But the German high command, fighting Russia in the war, sees an opportunity.
Oh, this is such a crazy part of the story.
They essentially view Lenin as a biological weapon. They put him on a sealed train, smuggle him across the battle lines, and inject him into the chaos of Petrograd, hoping he will destabilize the Russian war effort.
And Lenin exceeds their wildest expectations. Because while the moderate politicians are giving long, flowery speeches about the slow march to democracy, Lenin steps off the train and proves himself to be a master of ruthless political pragmatism.
He really does.
He assesses the chaos, he looks at the starving, angry masses, and he completely bypasses the theoretical Marxist debates. He offers the population a three-word platform: peace, land, bread.
It is brilliant in its targeted simplicity.
It really is.
He didn't promise them a complex dialectic transition to a socialist utopia.
Yeah.
He promised exactly what they were already violently demanding.
Yeah.
Peace. We will unconditionally pull out of the war with Germany today, no matter the cost.
Land.
We officially endorse the peasants, seizing the noble estates. It's yours now. Bread. We will ruthlessly secure the food supply for the starving urban workers.
Lenin tapped directly into the raw survivalist pulse of the nation.
Absolutely.
The Bolshevik Party was originally designed to be this tiny, elite vanguard of professional underground revolutionaries. But with this message, their popularity absolutely explodes. They surge from roughly 24,000 members in February to over 350,000 members by October.
Yeah, a massive increase.
They sprinted to the front of a parade that the people were already marching in.
But gaining popularity in the Soviets is one thing, seizing state power is another.
Here.
And Lenin is handed the keys to the state by the sheer incompetence of Alexander Kerensky.
Kerensky really messed up.
Big time.
Mm-hmm.
In August of 1917, Kerensky faces a massive crisis. A conservative military general named Kornilov decides the country is falling to anarchy, and he marches his troops toward Petrograd to stage a right-wing military coup and crush the Soviets.
Kerensky panics. He realizes he has alienated the army and he has no loyal troops left to defend the capital. So what does he do? He makes a deal with the devil. He turns to the radical left. He opens up the armories and hands thousands of rifles to the Bolshevik workers' militias, known as the Red Guards, begging them to defend the city against Kornilov's army.
It is a textbook fatal error.
Such a bad idea.
Kornilov's coup ultimately fizzles out before it reaches the city first. Railway workers refuse to move his trains, and his soldiers mutiny. But the damage is done.
The guns are already out there.
By arming the Bolsheviks to save his own skin, Kerensky utterly destroyed his government's monopoly on force. He legitimized and heavily armed the exact faction that openly stated they wanted to overthrow him.
It is incredible how rapidly the moderate center collapses when it tries to play both extremes against each other.
It happened so fast.
Because just 2 months later, in late October 1917, Lenin decides the time is right. Those exact same heavily armed Red Guards, coordinated by Lenin's brilliant lieutenant Leon Trotsky, fan out across Petrograd. They seize the telegraph offices, the train stations, the bridges, and finally, they storm the Winter Palace and arrest the provisional government.
The October Revolution. It wasn't a mass popular uprising like February. It was a highly organized surgical coup d'etat by a radical minority.
Wow.
Lenin walks into the Soviet Congress and announces that the Bolsheviks have seized state power.
But seizing a palace in Petrograd is vastly different from conquering a collapsed continent-spanning empire.
Very true.
Lenin has the capital, but his authority barely extends past the suburbs. Most of the country is in armed anarchy. To have any chance of surviving, Lenin has to deliver on his first promise: peace.
And he proves he meant what he said, though the cost is staggering.
Oh, it happens.
He sends Trotsky to negotiate with the German high command. And when the Germans present their terms, they are extortionate. But Lenin forces the Bolsheviks to accept them. In early 1918, they signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk.
The concessions are hard to fathom. Lenin officially signs away roughly a third of the entire Russian Empire's population, its best agricultural land in Ukraine, and the vast majority of its coal and iron reserves.
That's a massive loss.
Under normal political math, no government could survive surrendering that much territory.
But Lenin's math was entirely focused on survival.
Right.
He knew that if the German army kept advancing, they would hang every Bolshevik in Petrograd. He traded space for time.
Smart.
He believed that a communist revolution was going to break out in Germany any day now anyway, making the borders irrelevant. He bought a momentary pause.
But the peace with Germany just trades an international war for a domestic meat grinder. Almost immediately, Russia plunges into a catastrophic civil war that lasts from roughly 1918 to 1920.
Yeah, the Civil War.
It is the Reds, the Bolsheviks versus the Whites.
And we must be clear about who the Whites were because it was not a unified army.
Okay, who were they?
The Whites were a fractured, chaotic coalition of anyone who hated the Bolsheviks. You had monarchist generals trying to put a czar back on the throne. You had liberal Democrats who were furious about the coup.
So a total mix.
You had rogue warlords just carving out personal fiefdoms in Siberia. And critically, you had nationalist armies in places like Ukraine and the Caucasus who saw the collapse of the central state as their chance to finally win ethnic independence.
Plus, you have massive foreign intervention.
Oh, yeah.
The governments of the United States, Great Britain, France, and Japan look at the Bolsheviks, a regime that has just defaulted on all the czar's massive foreign debts, confiscated billions in foreign-owned factory capital, and is openly broadcasting calls for the global working class to rise up and murder their capitalist bosses. And they are terrified.
They are panicking.
They send weapons, funding, and actual troops to port cities like Vladivostok and Archangel to support the Whites and try to strangle the communist state in its crib.
This multi-front assault profoundly alters the psychological DNA of the Bolshevik state.
Oh, so?
They were completely surrounded, invaded by the most powerful capitalist empires on Earth, and fighting a dozen different Civil War armies.
That's a lot of pressure.
This intense paranoia necessitates the rapid creation of absolute authoritarian institutions. The dream of a decentralized worker-run democracy dies instantly.
To survive, they build two massive tillers of coercion. First, Leon Trotsky takes the chaotic, democratic militias of 1917 and brutally hammers them into the Red Army.
Yep.
He brings back the death penalty for desertion. He recruits former Tsarist officers and holds their families hostage to ensure loyalty. And he builds a 5 million-man fighting force.
And second, they established the Cheka.
Oh, the Cheka.
The Cheka was the first iteration of the Soviet secret police, the predecessor to the KGB. Their mandate was to root out counter-revolutionaries, saboteurs, and spies.
Right.
But in the chaos of the Civil War, they operated without any legal restraint, initiating the Red Terror, executing thousands of suspected enemies, priests, and striking workers without trial.
And to feed this massive Red Army, while the economy is completely shattered, the Bolsheviks implement a set of emergency economic policies known as war communism.
War communism was a command economy born of absolute desperation.
Yeah.
The Bolsheviks realized they couldn't rely on market forces to supply the army, because the currency had hyperinflated to worthlessness and the peasants were refusing to sell their grain for useless paper money.
So what did they do?
So the state simply outlawed free trade entirely. They nationalized every industry down to small workshops.
Wow. And most devastatingly, they instituted forced grain requisitioning.
That was the worst part.
The government sent armed squads of thugs from the cities out into the rural villages. Their orders were to simply steal whatever food they could find to feed the soldiers and the factory workers.
And they didn't just take the grain, they deliberately engineered class warfare within the villages.
Really? How did they do that?
The Bolsheviks told the poorest peasants, the slightly wealthier peasants, the kulaks, are hoarding grain. If you point out where it is hidden, we will take it, give you a cut, and punish them.
Oh, that's just evil.
They tried to fracture the solidarity of the Mir to extract the resources they needed to survive.
The economic devastation of war communism, layered on top of the destruction of World War I and the Civil War, is almost mathematically impossible to grasp.
It's just off the charts.
By 1920, industrial production was at perhaps 15% of what it had been before the war began. The cities had emptied out as starving workers fled back to the countryside just to find a potato.
Ultimately, the Red Army defeats the fragmented White armies.
Because they were just too divided.
Yeah, the Bolsheviks had the advantage of controlling the central industrial hub of Moscow and Petrograd and a unified command structure, while the Whites were spread thin on the peripheries and hated each other almost as much as they hated Lenin.
Right.
The Bolsheviks win the war, but they are ruling over a graveyard.
The radical measures of war communism left the entire population furious, starving, and exhausted. And the ultimate, undeniable symbol of this blowback comes in early 1921, from an incredibly ironic source, the Kronstadt naval base.
The Kronstadt Rebellion is the ideological shattering of the early Soviet dream.
Explain why they matter so much.
Okay.
Because the sailors at Kronstadt weren't Tsarist nobles.
Exactly. The Kronstadt sailors were the most radical, die-hard revolutionaries in the entire country.
Right.
They were the ones who mutinied in 1917. Lenin himself had called them the pride and glory of the revolution. But by 1921, these exact same sailors look at the reality of war communism. They see their families starving in the villages because of grain requisitioning. They see the Cheka executing striking workers. And they realize the Bolshevik Party has just become a new set of unaccountable dictators.
So they rebel. They issue demands that are deeply embarrassing to Lenin. They demand free elections to the Soviets, freedom of speech for workers, and an end to the armed grain squads.
Yeah.
And how does Lenin respond to his most loyal revolutionary heroes asking for basic rights?
He sends the Red Army across the frozen ice of the Baltic Sea to ruthlessly massacre them.
That's brutal.
Thousands are killed or sent to prison camps. But the shock, the Kronstadt Rebellion, forces Lenin into a profound realization.
What's that?
He realizes that if the government continues the brutal extraction of war communism, the peasantry will eventually rise up and destroy them. The regime is hanging by a thread.
So Lenin slams on the brakes. He introduces a massive policy reversal called the NEP, the New Economic Policy.
The NEP was a strategic retreat.
Okay.
It was an acknowledgement that you cannot simply decree a socialist economy into existence overnight in a shattered country. Lenin rolls back war communism.
That's a huge shift.
He stops the forced grain requisitioning and replaces it with a predictable tax. Crucially, he allows the peasants to go back to free market capitalism.
Oh, wow.
They can grow food, pay their tax, and sell the surplus for private profit. He also allows small private businesses to open in the cities.
It's essentially a hostage negotiation with reality.
Yeah.
Lenin realizes he has to inject a little bit of capitalism into the system just to incentivize the farmers to grow food so the entire nation doesn't starve to death.
Exactly. So what does this all mean? It means the utopian theoretical dream of a perfect, moneyless Marxist society was instantly violently overwritten by the brutal math of wartime survival and agricultural reality.
Yeah.
The Bolsheviks learned a dark lesson. Maintaining state power required deep ideological compromises, and when compromise failed, it required ruthless, overwhelming force.
And that lesson becomes the defining central feature of the Soviet state, because the era of Lenin's pragmatism is incredibly brief.
Very brief.
In 1924, after a series of massive strokes, Vladimir Lenin dies, and his death opens up a sprawling power vacuum at the top of the party, paving the way for the rise of one of history's most terrifyingly effective operators.
The power struggle to succeed Lenin was not a democratic election. It was a vicious, behind-the-scenes battle within the elite circles of the Communist Party. And it primarily came down to three men with fundamentally different visions for the future. You had Leon Trotsky, the brilliant, arrogant military hero and intellectual who commanded the Red Army.
Okay.
You had Nikolai Bukharin, the popular, affable theorist who is heavily associated with managing the mixed economy, the NEP.
Yeah.
And then you had Joseph Stalin.
Stalin is such a fascinating, dark figure in this history because he completely defies the archetypes of a charismatic revolutionary leader.
It really does.
If you looked at Trotsky, he was giving fiery, poetic speeches to crowds of thousands, whipping them into a frenzy. Stalin spoke quietly with a heavy Georgian accent. He wasn't an intellectual. He was the ultimate relentless bureaucratic operator.
Stalin's absolute genius was recognizing the shift in the historical winds.
How so?
He realized that the era of romantic revolution, of storming barricades and giving speeches, was over. The era of administration had begun.
Ah, I see.
The power no longer lay in the streets, it lay in the filing cabinets. As the general secretary at the party, Stalin didn't seek the spotlight. He sought the paperwork.
It's like the quiet guy in the corporate office who volunteers to manage human resources, handle all the meeting schedules, and hire the interns.
That's a perfect analogy.
While the visionary executives are giving keynote speeches, he is quietly, methodically rewriting the organizational chart so that every single middle manager in the company owes their job directly to him.
That is exactly how he conquered the Soviet Union. The sources describe how the Central Committee debates would rage late into the night.
Yeah.
Long after Trotsky or Bukharin had gone home to sleep, Stalin would still be sitting at the table, smoking his pipe, finalizing the meeting minutes, and assigning his loyalists to obscure but vital provincial posts.
Wow. just quietly building his empire.
When it finally came time for a vote, Trotsky would look around the room and realize that Stalin had methodically replaced every single voting delegate with his own men.
And Stalin masterfully plays his rivals against each other. First, he aligns with Bukharin to isolate Trotsky.
Right.
He plays on the old guard's fear of Trotsky's military power, eventually getting Trotsky expelled from the party, exiled from the country, and decades later, assassinated with an ice axe in Mexico.
Which is just, yeah, wild end to that story.
Once Trotsky is gone, Stalin pivots. He looks at the agricultural sector under the NEP, which is struggling to provide enough grain for rapid industrialization, and he uses that to brand Bukharin as weak and incompetent.
He essentially clears the board.
Yeah.
By the late 1920s, Stalin has achieved absolute, unquestioned dictatorial power.
Okay.
And once he is fully in control, he enacts a massive ideological shift.
What's the shift?
The original Bolsheviks deeply believed their revolution was just the opening act for a global, worldwide communist uprising.
Right.
But when the workers in Germany and Britain failed to revolt, Stalin pivoted.
Right.
He introduced the doctrine of socialism in one country.
The goal is no longer waiting for a global brotherhood of workers. The goal is the immediate, ruthless survival and industrial domination of the Soviet Union, surrounded by hostile capitalist enemies at absolutely any cost.
To achieve that domination, Stalin declares that the slow, mixed economy approach of the NEP is over. In 1928, he unleashes the first of the 5-year plans.
Wow.
The state is going to take total central control of every single economic lever, and they're going to hyper-industrialize the country at a speed never before attempted in human history.
And we have to look at the mechanics of these 5-year plans, because they weren't what we would consider sound economic policy. They weren't precise, mathematically balanced spreadsheets ensuring steady growth.
No, they are massive, almost hysterical instruments of propaganda and terror. They were designed to capture the public's imagination and enforce total mobilization.
Okay.
The central planners in Moscow would simply invent impossible numbers.
They would decree, we demand that electrical power capacity be quadrupled in 5 years. We demand that steel production be increased by 300%.
Yeah, totally unrealistic goals.
When engineers nervously pointed out that they didn't have the rail capacity or the raw materials to do that, they were arrested as saboteurs and shot.
The message was clear. We are going to furiously drag this backward empire into the modern industrial age through sheer bleeding willpower and exhaustion.
Yeah.
They were building massive steel complexes like Magnitogorsk from scratch in the freezing mud of the Ural Mountains, using tens of thousands of laborers digging foundations by hand.
But this brings us back to the exact same math problem that defeated the Tsars. If you are building massive industrial cities out of nothing, you need millions of new urban workers, and those millions of workers need to eat.
Yep.
How do you feed a booming industrial workforce without spending all your capital importing food?
Stalin returned to the old playbook of squeezing the countryside, but he executed it with a level of mechanical ruthlessness that is genuinely terrifying.
Yeah, this part is incredibly dark.
He declares a total war on the peasantry. He mandates mass collectivization.
Collectivization was the policy of violently destroying the traditional village structure, right?
Yeah, exactly. The state forced individual peasant families to give up their private plots of land, hand over their livestock and tools, and merge into massive, state-run agricultural factories called kolkhozes.
Why? What was the logic there?
The theoretical logic was to eliminate the inefficiencies of the old strip farming system and force peasants to use tractors and work collectively, just like industrial workers on an assembly line.
But peasants, understandably, fiercely resisted. They had bled and died for centuries to finally own their own small piece of land.
Right.
When the armed party activists arrived in the villages to force them into the collectives, many peasants chose to slaughter their own horses and burn their own crops rather than hand them over to the state.
And Stalin's response to this resistance was apocalyptic. He ordered the liquidation of the kulaks as a class.
Wow.
The state labeled anyone who resisted or anyone who simply owned an extra cow as a wealthy capitalist hoarder. Hundreds of thousands of the best, most productive farmers were arrested, packed into cattle cars, and deported to the frozen wastelands of Siberia to die in labor camps.
And the human cost of stripping the countryside of its best farmers and confiscating all the grain to feed the cities led directly to the Great Famine of 1932 to 1933.
The scale of the suffering is difficult to conceptualize.
Yeah.
Entire regions, particularly in Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and the Caucasus, were starved to death. Historians estimate between 3 and 4 million people died of famine in those 2 years.
And there is a deep historical debate about the intent behind this famine, right? Was this an engineered genocide, or was it a catastrophic failure of bureaucracy?
It's heavily debated. Many argue it was a deliberate policy of weaponized starvation, a genocide engineered by Stalin to break the back of Ukrainian nationalism and crush peasant resistance once and for all.
And the other side?
Others argue it was the catastrophic result of a terrified bureaucracy. Local party bosses were so afraid of being executed for missing their grain quotas that they sent armed squads to strip the villages bare, confiscating even the seed grain needed for next year's crop, and deliberately hiding the mass starvation from Moscow.
Regardless of the central intent, the mechanical reality on the ground was millions of men, women, and children dying in agony, eating grass and tree bark, while the Soviet state continued to export grain to Western Europe to buy industrial machinery.
And this agrarian devastation, combined with the desperate need for factory labor, triggered one of the largest, fastest demographic shifts in human history.
Wow.
To escape the famine and the terror of the collectives, roughly 10 million people fled the countryside and migrated into the industrial cities in just 4 years.
Which brings us to the agonizing paradox of the Soviet experiment under Stalin. Because despite the unimaginable horror, the mass deportations, and the millions dead of starvation, the industrialization policy actually worked in terms of raw, brutal metrics.
It did. While the capitalist West was completely paralyzed by the Great Depression in the 1930s, the Soviet economy was booming.
Really?
Yeah, entire new industrial cities sprouted across the Siberian frontier. Steel output jumped by 50%. Coal production doubled. They achieved the breakneck developmentalism they had promised. They built a heavy industrial base that would, a decade later, be capable of manufacturing the thousands of tanks and planes needed to defeat Nazi Germany.
And they were restructuring society in the cities. They established the social safety net that early capitalism lacked.
Right.
The state guaranteed employment, free health care, state-run education, and subsidized housing. And for a specific, crucial subset of the population, the revolution delivered a massive, unprecedented wave of upward mobility. Our sources refer to this as proletarian promotion.
This is a vital mechanic for understanding how the regime survived.
How so?
As the state expanded its control over literally every single aspect of the economy and society, it required a massive, sprawling bureaucracy to manage it all. Someone had to manage the factories, allocate the housing, and track the quotas.
So Stalin reaches down into the factory floors. He takes roughly 1.5 million ordinary, uneducated industrial workers, sends them to technical schools, and promotes them into white-collar administrative and party jobs.
It was a stroke of evil political genius.
Yeah.
By lifting 1.5 million poor workers into this newly created, powerful middle class, Stalin instantly bought the absolute, die-hard loyalty of an entire generation.
Because they owe him everything.
Exactly. These new elites owed their apartments, their authority, their entire social existence directly to Stalin and the Soviet state. They became the bedrock foundation of his power.
By 1934 to 1936, on paper, it looks like the revolution has successfully stabilized. Stalin even introduces a new, supposedly democratic constitution that guarantees voting rights and officially declares that the era of class warfare is over. The utopian vision appears to have been achieved.
But the reality is that Stalin has simply constructed a technologically advanced totalitarian nightmare.
Right.
Because just as he's declaring that the enemies of socialism have been defeated, he turns the machinery of state terror inward. Between 1936 and 1938, he unleashes the Great Purges, and the system violently consumes its own creators.
Walk us through the psychology of the purges. Why would a dictator who has just successfully industrialized his country and achieved total power suddenly start arresting his own top generals and party leaders?
The purges were driven by a toxic mix of Stalin's own profound clinical paranoia and a cold, strategic calculation regarding the international situation.
Okay.
Stalin watched the rise of fascism in Germany with Adolf Hitler. He knew that a massive war was inevitably coming, and he knew that the capitalist powers in the West would be thrilled to see the Soviet Union destroyed.
So he preempts it.
Yes. He decided he needed to absolutely preemptively ensure that if a crisis hit, there would not be a single alternative leader, a single dissenting voice, or a single independent thought within his entire empire.
So he utilizes the Cheka, now renamed the NKVD, to begin arresting hundreds of thousands of people. Anyone who had ever questioned him in a meeting 10 years ago, anyone who had supported Trotsky or Bukharin, anyone whose neighbor denounced them to steal their apartment.
Yep.
And the most public chilling mechanism of this terror were the show trials.
The show trials were public spectacles broadcast to the world, where the prominent, famous, high-ranking members of the original Bolshevik Party, the men who had helped Lenin run the revolution, were put on trial for their lives.
Wow.
But the verdicts were scripted long before the trial ever began.
The psychological torture involved here is staggering. These old revolutionaries, men who had survived Tsarist prisons, were taken to the basements of the secret police.
Yeah.
They were subjected to weeks of sleep deprivation, beatings, and rubber cells, but the ultimate lever was always their families. The interrogators would say, "If you do not confess, we will shoot your wife and send your children to an orphanage." And so, they broke.
These proud revolutionaries were marched into courtrooms in front of international journalists, and they publicly confessed to utterly absurd, impossible crimes.
Like what?
They confessed to being fascist spies, to sabotaging train lines, to plotting to assassinate Stalin.
Unbelievable.
And part of the script was that they had to implicate their colleagues before they were inevitably taken down to the cellar and shot in the back of the head.
The scale of this self-inflicted terror is almost incomprehensible. Stalin severely crippled his own government and completely decapitated the leadership of his own Red Army right on the eve of World War II.
It's true.
Over 700,000 people were formally executed during the purges. Hundreds of thousands more were stripped of their rights and sent to the gulags, the vast network of brutal, freezing prison labor camps that stretched across Siberia, where they were worked to death mining gold or cutting timber.
It is the ultimate tragedy of the ideological arc.
Yeah.
A movement that began with starving, desperate workers marching through the snow to beg their czar for a little relief. A movement that promised peace, land, and bread, and that genuinely sought to end the brutal economic exploitation of the peasantry. Ultimately transformed itself into a paranoid, mechanized, totalitarian apparatus that chewed up and destroyed millions of its own people.
If we pull all these massive threads together and synthesize this journey, we can see the tragic mechanics of it all. The Russian Revolution was born from the fatal weakness of a 300-year-old autocratic system that tried to force selective modernization onto a brutally exploited population.
Right.
When the Tsarist system cracked under the pressure of its own arrogant incompetence and the mechanized slaughter of World War I, Lenin and the Bolsheviks seized the moment.
And we have to acknowledge that they succeeded in their raw developmental objective.
They did.
They took a massive, illiterate, agrarian peasant society that was losing wars to everyone, and they violently forged it into a modern, literate, industrial superpower in a matter of a few decades.
Wow.
And they established an ideology that would polarize the entire globe, triggering a decades-long struggle between capitalism and state socialism.
But the cost of achieving that rapid developmentalism was astronomical. To achieve their goals in such an insanely condensed timeline, the Soviet state relied on forced collectivization, engineered famine, and bureaucratic terror.
They tore down the absolute, inefficient autocracy of the Tsar, and they replaced it with an even more absolute, technologically advanced autocracy of the party.
Which brings us back to that collapsing building we discussed at the very beginning.
Exactly.
The architects of the Russian Revolution looked at their backward society and decided that the only way to build a modern, equitable utopia was to dynamite the entire old structure while the population was still inside, and then force the traumatized survivors to build the new world at gunpoint.
They proved that a state with no limits can force massive, rapid industrialization. But they also proved the terrifying, catastrophic human toll of absolute state power, unconstrained by individual human rights.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with something to chew on. When you look around today at the sheer speed of societal, economic, and technological change happening in your own life, it's worth remembering how Russia tried to leap centuries of economic development in a single generation, and the unimaginable, bloody price ordinary people paid for that speed.
Definitely something to consider.
The Tsars and the Soviets fundamentally shared one core belief. They both firmly believed that they could use advanced technology, massive bureaucracies, and rapid industrialization to enforce total top-down control without ever giving their people true political freedom.
Right.
Looking at our world today, as technology and economic shifts accelerate faster than ever before, is it possible for a modern society to undergo massive, rapid transformation without leaving a vast, disillusioned segment of its population behind to bear the agonizing cost?
It's a heavy thought.
Something to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.